For those who are 80s or 90s babies, we grew up with a show called Will and Grace. In the show, Will is a gay man who lives with his best friend Grace, and they have two friends, Karen, who is married to a man named Stan, and their fun, irresponsible, and flamboyant friend Jack, who is also gay. There is an episode called Who's Your Daddy, which is in the second episode of the 9th season of the second series. Will is dating a younger man in his 20s named Blake. Blake makes a reference to the Stonewall Uprising, but completely misremembers the name. Will, in frustration, tells Blake how important it is to remember events like that because they helped pave the way for men like Blake to be able to live with the freedoms that Will and Jack were not afforded when they were his age. Will goes on a rant, educating this young man about the events, and at the end he triumphantly yells, "And that is the night that the lights went out in Georgia." Well, the reference to the excellent country song doesn't quite align with what he was saying. Stonewall still had a huge impact, as it was an event that was a pivotal moment in LGBTQ history. You are listening to part 2 of the LGBTQ rights movement. I'm your host, Lauren Powers, and you are listening to Not Your History Class podcast. Our standard education has barely touched upon the depth, violence, and tragedy of human history. My intention with this podcast is to illuminate the parts of our history that have been in the dark for far too long. I want to take a comprehensive dive into our world and to give a different and new perspective on our past. After all, education is our strongest weapon against tyranny. Please note, this podcast contains content and information that may not be suitable for children under the age of 13. Please be advised. In 1955, the Daughters of Bilitis, one of the first lesbian organizations that was formed in San Francisco, although several chapters were founded in other parts of America and Australia as well. During this time, lesbians, like gay men, were subjected to discrimination and public hostility. This organization was focusing mostly on lesbian rights rather than it being a social organization. This was a radical group as there was so much stigma against homosexuality at the time. The group wondered if they should align themselves with other male-dominated gay rights groups such as the Mattachine Society, or just identify with lesbian separatist feminists, which is part of the reason that it met its dissolution in the 1970s, although local chapters still persisted. Daughters of Bilitis was vital as it was a place for women who were gay to meet and share everyday struggles that they had with homophobia and life in general, and it set a precedent for lesbians to seek equal rights and to place lesbian rights on the civil rights path. In 1965, the word transgender was used for one of the first times in a professional paper called Sexual Hygiene and Pathology by John F. Olivan. The book was objective, unbiased, and critical. It talked about relevant research findings and used them with clinical terms. It is mostly meant for physicians, but psychologists can use it as well, as it discusses normal sexual development, sex education, and sex pathology. One of the first openly transgender individuals was named Christine Jorgensen, born biologically male. In World War II, she had been drafted into the war, and after the war ended, she had heard about these procedures that allowed someone to transition into the opposite gender. In the 1950s, she traveled to Denmark, where she had a series of surgeries, including hormone therapy that transformed her body into the female form. Initially, her surgeries were meant to be private, but someone she knew who remained unidentified had contacted the press. On December 1st, 1952, the New York Daily News posted an article about her with photos, and the headline, "Ex-GI Becomes Blonde Beauty, Operations Transform Bronx Youth." She essentially became an international celebrity overnight. In 1953, when she returned to the United States, she was arranged with the press to create a public spectacle. While she was not the first transgender person in American history, she was the most publicly recognized one at the time. She used the autobiography she wrote in 1967 to talk about the acceptance of transgender individuals. She struggled with depression and society's heteronormative expectations. In her autobiography, she wrote, quote, "The answer to the problem must not lie in sleeping pills and suicides that look like accidents or in jail sentences, but rather in life and the freedom to live it," end quote. In 1958, there was a Supreme Court case called 1 Inc. vs. Olison. It was a historical win for gay and lesbian rights. As mentioned before, the Mattachine Society was formed and some individuals later separated and created 1 Inc. They created a magazine called One Magazine, which was the United States' first widely distributed gay magazine. It ended up facing a huge legal battle. Los Angeles Postmaster Otto Olison described it as, quote, "obscene, lewd, lascivious, and filthy," end quote. And it violated obscenity laws, which, under the Comstock Act, which was a 1873 law that banned the mailing and receiving of obscene material, it also prohibited the mailing of mifepristone, a medication abortion pill. This threw Olison and 1 Inc. into a 4-year legal battle. In March 1956, Judge Thurman Clark of Southern District of California had ruled in Olison's favor. He said, quote, "The suggestion advanced that homosexuals should be recognized as a segment of our people and be accorded special privileges as a class is rejected," end quote. The decision was then upheld by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in February 1957. On June 13, 1957, the ruling was appealed to the Supreme Court by Eric Julber, the attorney who represented One Magazine. On January 13, 1958, the court agreed to hear 1 Inc. versus Olison and issued the ruling that the magazine did not violate obscenity laws. This was a historic case as it was the first Supreme Court case to address homosexuality and affirm the free speech rights of gays and lesbians. In 1962, Illinois became the first state to decriminalize homosexuality by repealing the sodomy laws the state had previously had in place. The next year, Bayard Rustin, an openly gay man, along with civil rights leader A. Philip Randolph, helped to organize a march on Washington to protest segregation, voting rights, and unemployment for Black Americans. Rustin was a friend and mentor to Martin Luther King Jr. and the organization of the march that led to King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech. In 1966, inside Gene Compton's cafeteria in San Francisco, a group of transgender women were being harassed by police, and in defense, one of the women stood up and threw a cup of coffee at the officer's face. Donna Persona, an activist and performer who used to go to the cafeteria as a teen, said about the group of transgender women that, quote, "These ladies took the bullets for us. Everyone in our community stands on their shoulders," end quote. The cafeteria, located in the Tenderloin neighborhood, was primarily a gay neighborhood and had become the world's first transcultural district. In 2005, a documentary called Screaming Queens about the event had come out, and in the documentary, a TV news report said about the Tenderloin that it was, quote, "for homosexuals and transvestites," end quote, and that they were engaging in the, quote, "marketplace of vice, degradation, and human misery," end quote. Where the reality is that these transgender individuals, specifically women in this instance, were looking for a safe space to live and just to be able to be themselves. Persona, also a transgender woman, had said that when she first met this group of women that, quote, "they were the most beautiful women I'd ever seen. It was like I'm home in a way. I really felt like I was in Wonderland. They took care of me like big sisters. They were just so sweet to me and each other," end quote. The Tenderloin district was only 2 miles away from the Castro neighborhood, which had mostly attracted gay white men, and in some ways was safer for women to live there, but regardless of where they went, these transgender women were harassed by police. They could be arrested for anything from female impersonation to obstructing the sidewalk, essentially making up crimes for them to be able to arrest these women. One of the witnesses, Colette Legrand, who was 15 when it happened but is now 68 and a performer, said that, quote, "meeting some of those girls, I thought they must have to be really strong," end quote. She saw one of the women being dragged off by an officer and beat her with a club. Quote, "there was not much we could do about it," end quote. In recent times, the Tenderloin has been known for the homeless population, drug use, and crime. The upside being that the rent in the area is great for low-income transgender people of color, but the conditions are not always good. Honey Mahogany, a co-founder of Compton's Transgender Cultural District, said that she knew of a person who had been hospitalized because there was a decomposing body upstairs that was leaking fluid into their apartment. There were also people dealing with bed bugs and filth. In retaliation, the women were throwing sugar shakers through the glass windows at the officers and beating the police with their purses. The night ended up with tables overturned, a police car that was destroyed, a newsstand on fire, and one of the women was arrested by officers. Arya Saeed, the director of the Tenderloin District, which is now legally recognized as the first trans district in the world, said that they were looking to grow the district, which spans only 6 blocks, into a place where transgender individuals can get help they need and opportunities for work, housing, job training, with the hope of having businesses there that are owned by trans people. She said, quote, "What does it look like to honor the legacy and the culture we've inherited as trans people? A culture of joy and resilience, in spite of our disparities and our marginalization. We can create a world where we are economically and culturally and socially empowered." End quote. Despite the steps that they have taken to improve the lives of transgender people in the Tenderloin District of San Francisco, Saeed said, quote, "As much as we feel we've made progress, the realities we face and disparities we still face are the same." End quote. Cecilia Chung, a transgender activist in San Francisco, still faces harassment from police for sleeping on the streets or other laws that criminalize the poor. Quote, "There are still a lot of people in the Tenderloin who are struggling to survive due to discrimination they are suffering." End quote. The reality of it is that there are many human rights that are under attack right now, even in 2025, although these episodes were written in 2024 and things are always changing. But what is so scary is that it could get worse. Chung said of the women who made such an impact that night in 1969 that, quote, "Ladies, you didn't live in vain. Your life is serving a bigger purpose now, and your story is never going to die." End quote. In 1967, on Mercer Street in Manhattan, New York, the first gay and lesbian bookstore was established and opened by Craig Rodwell, a gay man and named after Oscar Wilde, the author that was in prison for being gay. The bookstore contained work that talked about gay and lesbian issues in a positive light. Probably the biggest and most pivotal moment in LGBTQ rights history is called the Stonewall Uprising, which I mentioned in the introduction of this episode. On June 28, 1969, in the early morning hours, New York City cops began a raid against the bar patrons of the Stonewall Inn. A lot of people consider this the beginning of the gay rights movement, but as I've discussed previously, this is clearly not the case. Many refer to this incident as a riot, but many Stonewall veterans state that they prefer it to be called the Stonewall Rebellion or Uprising because a riot implies the police were justified in their use of force. Due to homosexuality being legal, many gay establishments at that time had to operate without a liquor license, which led to raids by the police. In fact, the Stonewall Inn was raided about once a month. The inn was also owned by the mafia, who didn't really care about their clientele or what was happening to them as long as they were making money. The owner just dealt with the raids, and corrupt police often tipped them off that there would be a raid happening, so the mafia could hide their liquor and other illegal activities that may have been going on at the inn. Stonewall Inn was not the only gay bar that was being raided. The New York State Liquor Authority shut down and penalized known establishments that served alcohol without a liquor license or were suspected to serve the LGBTQ community, and referred to the gathering of homosexual individuals to be disorderly. While these regulations had been overturned 3 years earlier in 1966, engaging in gay behavior in public was frowned upon. Due to being mafia-owned, the Stonewall Inn still operated without a liquor license. That was because at the time, there was an attempt to circumvent liquor license laws, so the Stonewall operated under what was called a bottle club. This wasn't unusual for gay bars to do this in New York at the time. Private clubs did not need a liquor license, as patrons were expected to bring and provide their own alcohol. In order to maintain an illusion of exclusivity, the Stonewall had people sign in their name in a book before coming in, although pseudonyms were almost exclusively used. The safety and hygiene of the bar had corners cut by the mafia. The bartenders didn't have access to running water behind the bar, so drinks were often served in dirty and used glasses. There was an outbreak of hepatitis among the patrons in 1969, which many blamed the bad hygiene at the bar on the outbreak. Not only that, but the inn was in violation of city code. It didn't have a real exit, only a front exit, which in a fire emergency could be really terrible. The alcohol was rumored to be bootlegged or stolen and was watered down, but was still sold at top shelf prices. The mafia, the owners of the Stonewall Inn, had also allegedly engaged in extortion. They would single out wealthy patrons that were not out about their sexuality and would blackmail them for large amounts of money. They would threaten to out this patron if they did not pay, and the blackmail ended up being one of the most lucrative aspects of the inn's management. In 1966, the Mattachine Society had staged what they called a sip-in, where they basically went to different locations, openly declared their sexuality, and dared to have staff turn them away. And if they did turn them away, they would sue the establishment. The Commission on Human Rights ruled that homosexuals have a right to be served in bars, and after that, police raids were reduced temporarily. The mafia saw a lot of prospects in catering to gay clientele that had been shunned. By the 1960s, the Genovese crime family controlled most of the bars in Greenwich Village. In 1966, Stonewall Inn, a straight bar, was bought, renovated, and reopened as a gay bar in 1967. The Genovese mafia family bribed New York's 6th police precinct to ignore what was happening in the club. Stonewall Inn welcomed drag queens who were not really accepted elsewhere. At night, runaways or homeless gay youth could spend time there as it was relatively cheap to enter. It was also one of the few gay bars that allowed dancing. On June 28, 1969, without any previous knowledge of the raid, the police entered the club. Armed with a warrant, they beat up customers, including arresting 13 individuals, including employees that violated the gender-appropriate state statute. Female officers would take suspected cross-dressers into the bathroom to check their gender. Patrons were understandably very angry at this humiliating turn of events. Instead of leaving Stonewall, patrons started to hang outside, and the crowd became more agitated. The inciting event that occurred was when a gay woman was being pushed into a police van and a cop hit her over the head. She started to yell at onlookers to act, which caused the crowd to start throwing pennies, cobblestones, bottles, and other objects at the police. Prisoners, police, and a writer for the Village Voice had barricaded themselves, and the patrons started to attempt to breach the barricade, but they were unsuccessful. So in an attempt to draw them out, they started to set fire to the bar. Remember, the bar had no other exit, so if they had been successful at setting it on fire, it could have killed a lot of individuals. The fire department and riot squad doused the flames and rescued those inside the bar. The protests were not finished, though, and they continued for the next 5 days, sometimes with thousands of people participating. At one point, the Village Voice had published an account of the riots. The Stonewall Uprising was certainly not the first time that gay individuals had fought for equal rights, but it was a huge catalyst in making meaningful change. Numerous gay rights organizations arose, including the Gay Liberation Front, the Human Rights Campaign, GLAAD, which is formerly the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, and PFLAG, which is formerly Parents, Families, and Friends of Lesbians and Gays. On June 28, 1970, a year after the uprising, thousands of people marched in the streets of Manhattan from Stonewall Inn to Central Park, called Christopher Street Liberation Day, America's first gay pride parade. The official chant of the parade was, "Say it loud, gay is proud." In 2016, President Obama designated the site of the uprising a national monument in recognition of the area's contribution to gay rights. This area included Stonewall Inn, Christopher Park, and nearby streets and sidewalks. In 1970, gay rights activists protested at the annual American Psychological Association, aka APA, meeting in San Francisco. At the time, the theories about homosexuality was that there was perhaps a treatment or a cure for being gay. The activists argued that this continues to push the idea that there is a stigma in being gay. In 1971 APA meeting, there was a panel discussion called Gay is Good that invited gay activists to speak. The activists spoke about the discrimination they experienced due to them being diagnosed with homosexuality. The next year, in 1972, a doctor named Dr. H. Anonymous, a homosexual psychiatrist, spoke to the crowd. He was disguised in a large suit, had a mask, and with a microphone to disguise his voice. He feared that if he was outed, it would have a negative impact on his career. In 1973, at the APA meeting, the conclusion came that in order for homosexuality, quote, to be considered a psychiatric disorder, it must either regularly cause subjective distress or regularly be associated with some generalized impairment in social effectiveness or functioning, end quote. In the DSM-2 that was printed in 1973, homosexuality was changed to sexual orientation disturbance. As I had said earlier, by 1980, the DSM referred to homosexuality as ego-dystonic homosexuality. 7 years later, in 1987, when it was printed again, it categorized homosexuality was a, quote, sexual disorder not otherwise specified, end quote. By 2013, homosexuality was completely removed from the DSM-5 as it was no longer considered a mental illness. In 1974, Elaine Noble, who was the first gay person to be elected to the state legislature in the Massachusetts House of Representatives, she faced a great deal of harassment, including bomb threats, her windows being broken at her headquarters, her car was destroyed, and she was even spit on by an 85-year-old man. Nevertheless, she fought against the status quo, and she won with 59% of the vote in her favor. In Dade County, Florida, there was an ordinance passed in 1977 that protected LGBTQ people from discrimination in housing, employment, and other services. Anita Bryant, a pop star and singer, had formed the group Save Our Children and started to spread rumors that homosexuals were corrupt and that they recruited youth to join their movement. That same year, the Human Unders Attack Committee, called the HUAC, was formed to fight against Bryant's rhetoric. HUAC urged consumers to boycott Florida orange juice products as Bryant was the spokesperson for Florida orange juice commercials. Senator John Briggs of California then introduced a bill to fire teachers that, quote, publicly engaged in or promoted homosexuality, end quote. Her crusade was successful, and the law was appealed, but this was not the end for Anita Bryant. Harvey Milk, the openly gay politician, had been elected to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. In 1978, he gave a speech called the Hope Speech that opposed the Briggs Initiative, aka Proposition 6. On November 7, 1978, Proposition 6 was overturned by 1 million votes. It was a huge milestone and a win for gay rights. While Anita Bryant had supporters, she also experienced a backlash, and due to that, she lost work and sponsorships. Only 20 days later, on November 27, 1978, both Harvey Milk and Mayor George Moscone were assassinated at City Hall in San Francisco, California, by Dan White. White was angry because Moscone had not reappointed him to the city board. He killed the mayor first, and then he turned his gun on rival Milk and he shot him. White was soon caught after and pleaded diminished capacity defense, which he stated was due to a lot of junk food and the stress of losing his job, and he suffered mental problems. Legally, diminished capacity is somewhat like the insanity defense. Insanity defense, if it were successful, would mean that the person would be declared not guilty and sent to a mental institution. Diminished capacity simply means a smaller sentence. His defense lawyers used the Twinkie defense, which is literally what it sounds like. It's an unconventional argument where the lawyer argues that White lacked the premeditation to commit the murder due to the sugary foods that he was eating, and eating those foods could lead to diminished capacity. He ended up being convicted of the lighter sentence of involuntary manslaughter. This was the first time that defense was ever used. On October 14, 1979, the first Gay and Lesbian Rights March occurred in Washington, D.C. 100,000 gay individuals marched on the capital city. This had been something that had been in the making for a while, but the death of Milk had started a national movement to commit to marching on Washington. Beverly Brubaker of Ohio said of the march, quote, "I knew we were not alone, but that was the first time I felt it to the very core of my being." End quote. Please subscribe to my podcast. And if you are listening on iTunes, please give the podcast 5 stars. It really helps me get out there. I am currently on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and X, so follow me on social media as well. If you are looking for sources for this episode, please check out our show notes. Transcripts and sources will be on my website, notyourhistoryclass.com. Researching, hosting, production, and editing is done by Lauren Powers. Theme song is done by Mike Meyers, and you can find him at the Mike Show 42 on X. If you have any recommendations or suggestions for a future episode, you can direct message me via social media or email me at notyourhistoryclass@gmail.com.